Okay, well, I'm getting ready to post this week's podcast, and Adobe Audition just helped me very efficiently eliminate the audio bed I had recorded, so I've got a little work there to redo. Thanks a lot, Adobe Audition. Anyway, this week's interview is one that I've really been looking forward to because it's talking to someone who's an expert in an area that I don't really know very much about. This is a chat with Katy Wood. I first met Katy at a party. I was visiting a friend's house, Andrew Pask, and he invited Katy over to the party, and she was incredibly engaging. I was a bit of an idiot, and she actually just glossed right over it. It was cool. And the more I heard about her and the more I heard people talk about her, the more I wanted to find out more about what she did. So luckily she was willing to take the time to give us an opportunity to chat, and this is it. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed doing it. All right, this week we have a very special guest. Her name is Katy Wood, and she was introduced to me by my friend Andrew Pask. She's part of my personal New Zealander posse, I guess. But she is the person that I would say that for this podcast, she's the person who has the longest IMDb listing. She's a sound editor and dialogue editor, and now a supervising editor for a lot of films, and I'll actually let her talk about what she does, but the consummate professional. And one of the things that really tweets me about Katy is that when I talk to Andrew and when I talk to other people that knew her or that know her, she's the person that they trust to do their most detailed work. That is always to me a sign of excellence, when people that I trust point to another person as being the most trustworthy person ever. So with that weird introduction, I give you Katy Wood. Hi, Katy. How are you?
Hi, Darwin. Very good. Thank you for such a glowing introduction.
Well, I didn't make it up. It just does seem like you really have people's attention as being super detailed. You have and having great ears, and so when that kind of trust factor in the sound world is a little bit hard to run by. Now, before I run too far down the "I Love You So Much" track, why don't we have you explain a little bit about your job and how you identify yourself?
Sure. Do you want me to explain a little bit about the process as well? I mean, I'm not entirely sure how many people out there, understand how the process works from filmmaking or not, but also I don't want to, talk to people like they're stupid.
Right. I think it would be useful if for no other reason than there is a lot of mystique around the whole Hollywood art world anyway. So I think it might make sense to talk a little bit about the process and then how your work fits into that.
Okay, sure thing. Well, I'm a sound editor. First and foremost, really. And basically what happens with a film is they shoot it, they edit the picture, and then, this is in simplistic terms, then are handed over to sound people to tidy up the existing sound, add new sounds, and so forth, and then those elements come together in a mix. And so those elements are divided ostensibly when it comes to mixing into 4 basic food groups. You've got dialogue, which is obviously all the chatty stuff. You've got sound effects, which is, cars, car starts, explosions, Tweety birds, cicadas, etc. Then you've got Foley, which is basically anything an actor does with their hands or body, so it's footsteps and rustles and bag movement and all that sort of thing. And then you've got music. So those 4 elements are what come together, is what comes together in the mix. So Oftentimes, when I say that we work on the sound as sound editors after the picture cut, that's somewhat premature because most of the time these days, budget dependent, of course, the picture is still being edited while we're working. So there's a certain point where we're concurrent, and particularly any film that has heavy visual effects, because they're scrambling as we are in the post-production process to do so at the end.
Right.
So I have worked in all those aspects for the most part, probably the least with music, other than maybe sort of producing the odd thing and, maybe mixing it down and so forth. But I'm not a musician, and music editing for film is kind of a different. It requires a skill set that I don't have, none the least of which is being able to read music. So all those elements come together in the mix, and then we sort of ship it out, and everybody goes, yay, and clinks their glasses. So that's the oversimplified sort of way of how that happens. And how long that process is and how many people are involved and all that sort of thing are dependent on budget and schedule. And sometimes those are intrinsically mixed, and sometimes they're not, because you can work on a very low budget project with very few people that just has an insanely long schedule because of the nature of it. Perhaps it's an ongoing documentary piece, or it's just something that's a bit of a passion project, so you work in pieces. So in which case it's not so much dependent, it's entirely dependent on budget, it's entirely dependent on schedule, and then you can work on other things which similarly go for an incredibly long time with a whole bunch of people because they just have way too much money, and off it goes. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell about the process. So basically what happens is I'm brought onto a project, depending on whether I'm a sound supervisor or as a sound editor. It depends on the timing, but a lot of the time these days we're not brought on terribly early in the project. The picture cut's been done, and we'll be brought on, a few weeks before the end of the director's cut process.
Okay.
And a standard American, kind of Hollywood director's cut period is 10 weeks. So that's 10 weeks from the end of shoot, where they get to make an assembly cut, a rough cut, put it together to show whoever financed it. That's sort of a standard thing. I think even in New Zealand, Australia, and England, where I've worked, it was sort of similar-ish, depending on the deal. So that gives the director an opportunity to put the cut together, and then at that point they screen it. And we may be brought on early in the process to do what's known as a temp mix. And a temp mix is where we maybe have just a few weeks, and we pretty much just grab all the elements, dust its bottom, mix it, and ship it so that it makes it a little more palatable for a studio head or somebody to watch or something like that. So we may be brought on then, or we may be brought on after. And when I say brought on, what we do is we then look at the film and whatever state it's in and start making notes about what it needs, what issues it has, where it's at. So if I'm wearing a dialogue hat, I'll be looking at, okay, right, what do we got here? What's the state of the original tracks? How was it recorded on the day? And on the day, I mean, obviously when it was, shot. The scene was shot, what issues might be there. You might discover that there weren't really any usable radio mics, so you've got to do everything off the boom being the mic dangling in the room as against the lavalier mic attached to the person.
Right.
Or you might find that the whole thing is such a visual effects heavy thing, and it's so it could have a big budget and a very good sound recordist and all those sorts of things, but the entire time the person's wearing a rubber suit prancing around a green screen with a fan on. So and so that sort of renders that somewhat useless as well. So you can come up with all sorts of issues that can have absolutely nothing to do with budget or the scale of the project. The issues are the issues. So then you start looking at, okay, well, we're obviously going to have to ADR. We're going to have to loop a lot of these lines. And ADR stands for additional dialogue replacement. And that's our loop. And what it is we bring the actors in again to, redo their lines, or maybe be changing them, and we get them to do that to picture, or maybe not, and that's basically the ADR process, and recognizing early how much of that you might have to do is important. So then we look at all those sorts of things and, start working with the director and all that sort of bits and pieces. Then if I'm wearing perhaps an effects hat or, if anybody's doing effects, they're going to be looking at what are the different environments, what are the different backgrounds. Is there anything that's really specialized or specific? Is there a prop in the film that's used that is unusual or specific? Like it could be a film where, let's say, it's got a lottery scene in it, so it has this very specific little mechanism with a winding handle and a mesh net and all these little ping pong balls going around or something like that.
Sure.
So you might need to go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of a specific thing. We might need to go and record that. So you're looking for the things that are going to be time, that are going to take time and are special. And you're also watching the film, whether you're doing dialogue or effects, you're looking at it for what are the special moments. And, and this is also apart from the spotting session that you'll have with the director and the picture editor at some point. But, you're just looking at it on its own merits and you're going, okay, well, this is obviously a big moment, and you can tell that because either it's an emotional scene or perhaps you can just tell in the arc of the story it's a turning point or something. So you're looking at that and you're looking at it for, okay, how many sound design elements of it? Does it have a lot of creatures in it, that aren't there yet? So basically the main character's standing there talking to a ping pong ball on a pole, that there eventually is going to become a very large, scary monster. And, but until then, that's what they're looking at. So you're like, I wonder what they're talking at too. So I try to get the script before I start a job if I can, but a lot of the time you don't. But once I start the job, I get the script and start looking at what perhaps the intention was of the writer, and then the director's realization of that can also be very revealing, how close it sticks to it or not. But you start to pick up things in the script and you read that and it sort of describes the environment, and that can be very revealing. So there's that part of the process. So you start spotting the film yourself, then you'll have a session hopefully with the director and the picture editor, and we'll run through the movie and talk about lines that might need to be added that they foresee and things they might want to do, and maybe talk about scenes that I think are issues for badly recorded dialogue because of the conditions or something, or maybe this is a sound design moment and ask about what was the vision for that and see what you can kind of glean from that. If you have an opportunity as well, it's nice, I think sometimes with some of those conversations to try to have them over as long a period of time as possible, schedule allowing, because then you can get to know the people a bit better. Sometimes, and I've told people this before, that it's quite good if you're working with somebody you've never worked with before and you just you start finding out what sorts of things they like. So you might start talking about what kind of food they like, and you have these endlessly long conversations about restaurants and sort of realize you haven't really done any spotting session, but in that time you kind of learned the nature of that person. So that makes it a bit more personable. So it helps to build a working relationship because you're basically trying to discover a language that's mutual at that point, because sound is intangible, and it's something that some people find quite easy to convey, especially if they're experienced directors and editors and so forth, convey what they want, and other people will only be able to tell you what they don't like. But somehow you've got to find a way to communicate so that you're able, as a sound editor, to deliver what it is they're after. So you have to find that language and ways of expressing yourself and understanding how they express themselves.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Now, in the course of your work, you've worked with some pretty high-end people. I mean, you've worked obviously with Peter Jackson in all of the Lord of Rings series. You worked with Peter Segal on Get Smart for sure. You worked with Clint Eastwood on a number of films. But I know from our past discussions, you come from humble roots. What is your background? What is it that got you to where you are?
Well, a number of things sort of fell into place. Let me think. So, yes, I'm from New Zealand, but as a kid I travelled around a lot because my father was in the Navy. so lived in a number of different places in New Zealand, and well, a couple of different places in New Zealand, and some places around the world. So that was quite advantageous, I think, for any kid. You know, it always makes you a little more curious. But I'd always been interested in sound in terms of how things sound, you know, like birds and so forth. But I think the thing that made me aware of sound being added to things, which is where I've ended up, you know, now, is when I was a kid, there was a TV show in New Zealand called Radio Times. I think that's what it was called anyway. It's a long time ago now. And what it was a bunch of New Zealand comedians would go around small provincial theatres and perform a radio play. And I grew up listening to the radio a lot. I still actually really like radio and radio plays and all that sort of stuff. And so they would perform these sort of plays, and they would have all kinds. So they were on a stage, and every now and again they would knock some of their props over, because they would have like a tray of sand or something, and they'd do the footsteps and all that sort of stuff, which I found fascinating. Every now and again they'd drop a prop, and then they'd have to incorporate that like they were on the radio. So it was kind of, they were doing some sort of, you know, circa 1940s sort of thing set in the jungle in Burma, and then one of them would knock over a door, and then they'd have to say, great, I'm so glad you found that portal into the other universe. You know, they just make stuff up, which I found fascinating and hilariously funny.
Sure.
You know, as a kid, it was just silly. It was improv.
Right.
And it was really cool, and so that started my understanding pretty early on that things, you know, of the process, I guess, and how much fun it looked. And so, you know, I did various different things, and I ended up, I worked in lots of, few music venues and stuff like that over the years on the bar, and I was never quite confident enough to head towards the mixing board or anything. That was always terribly intimidating. And but I did a few courses and this, that, and the other, and eventually ended up in going on location shoots with a sound recorder. So a location sound recording is of course a different thing to what I do now, but learning about boom operating and that sort of recording, and it was great. It was really good. The sound recorders is very good. Sound recorders called Ken Saville in New Zealand, still working, fabulous guy. And I learned a lot, but I also realized that I was more interested in the more creative side of things, which is post-production.
Sure.
So I sat in with various people that I was introduced to who did sound post, and at this time in New Zealand, we're talking mid-90s, and, you know, there really weren't very many people in the country who were doing it full-time. There was maybe, I don't know, I might get slaughtered for this guess, but I'd say it was about 25 people in the whole country doing it full-time, you know.
Right.
You know, doing features and TV series and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, you know, in terms of sound editing, then, of course, there's mixers and technicians and other people as well.
Right.
So I sat in, and basically I wouldn't go away. And they finally gave one in particular, a lovely man called Mike Hopkins, gave me a job on a film. And I really didn't know terribly much at all at that point, but he'd decided that my attitude was appropriate. And I think it's true that one's attitude is the probably the most integral thing to keeping you in post-production, because otherwise why the hell would you do it? And, you know, you've got to have that kind of drive. So I continued doing it and learning lots of stuff, and I still, and I just kept going with that, and worked in New Zealand for a number of years on all kinds of shows and films and TV, and also supplemented it with sound recording and boom operating and stuff when I could. Not that I wasn't terribly good at that, but I did it, or tried to, and did that, and then work ran out in New Zealand. It got very quiet, as it does in most countries. It comes in, you know, ebbs and flows, and I ended up going to the film school in Sydney called the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, which was great because they're incredibly well. It's changed quite drastically now, but it was very well funded. So they had great equipment, and because I knew already how to do my job ostensibly, I just wanted to fill in the gaps, because I think anybody doing any kind of profession, but particularly if you do so, I think on an experience base where you walk in and you just start working,
Right.
you end up with a lot of gaps in your knowledge, and I really wanted to fill some of that stuff in. So that was exactly what I managed to achieve, and that was really cool. And then I continued to work in New Zealand. So I worked in Australia after that for a couple of years, and then came back to New Zealand to work on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And after the end of that, I lived and worked in England for a while, and then came over to the States. And definitely, having worked on Lord of the Rings, and actually by that stage I'd done a stint back in New Zealand between England and the US on King Kong as well. And those being such big films and celebrated films as well, it
Right.
made it a little easier for me to be able to introduce myself in the US and work here. It wasn't necessarily a planned goal, though, any of this. I had no intention, actually, whatsoever of coming to Hollywood and working in Los Angeles or even living in Los Angeles. It kind of just worked out that way. I know it sounds terribly intentional, but in fact I saw myself, swigging wines or sangria in Spain and occasionally bopping over to London to do some sort of fantastically arty film from Finland. So I kind of had that concept in mind. It just didn't quite end up that way for a variety of other personal reasons. So it was all very good reasons. So the fact that I'm here now is fantastic, but it definitely wasn't a straight line.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure that any real artistic life ends up being a straight line. I think the people that plan on being artists end up being like baristas at Starbucks, right? And the people who are willing to go with the winds are the people that end up succeeding in the artful life. And yeah, that's quite a trail you took to get where you are today.
There are a few other bits in there, but
Sure. Well,
that's another conversation.
well, okay. We'll look into that. So I have some questions. First of all, I want to talk about this idea of you going to film school in Sydney to fill in the gaps. I think that that's actually a really, really interesting way to kind of frame what you did, because my assumption is, after working in New Zealand on a lot of TV and film things, it would have been very easy for you to just say, yeah, I've got a lot of experience and I can kind of grind out a career just doing this in some way. What is it that drove you to kind of dive into school again, and what are the actual gaps that got filled in that process?
Well, my drive was also that I felt, and this comes back to one of your earlier comments, which, was kind and not cruel, I don't think, where it's like, yeah, New Zealand is a small country down the bottom of the earth. And I never planned on living there even as long as I did, so I wanted to go out into the wider world and with something I wanted to be doing as well, how did I want to fill my days? So my drive to, stretch my wings a little further, I guess is the easy way of putting it. Going to Australia was the next easiest option. So I'd only been working in my chosen career, I guess, at that stage, but for about 3 years.
Okay.
And I think it's a little different here, but generally in my profession in sound editing for film, it's about the time you've spent doing it, the longevity, the experience you have. And there is an expectation that you will work as an assistant for quite some time. Like, you can work easily as an assistant for, I don't know, 8 years.
Okay.
And definitely in days gone by, especially when people worked on film and therefore with sound, it was on mag. Um, there was definitely that kind of length of time. It just took because it was such a long process at that stage, and
Right.
so there is definitely there is that, and I think there's a lot to be said for taking your time to get there, not of your own volition, but also not to be uh, necessarily assuming you're going to know it all. There's so much to know, which, quite frankly, is part of the reason I love it so much because you can't run out of things
Right. Right.
to learn or know about. That's one of the greatest things about doing sound for film or sound in general. It's like you'll always discover something new, whether it's a new instrument, an aspect, a toy, or whatever. There's always something different. A new creative opportunity, a new way to approach things. Um, so yeah, going to Australia was kind of to the film school there, and the gaps that I wanted to fill in were kind of varied. One of them was that I'd often worked for other people, and I learnt how to do cut a whole lot of sounds, and specific sounds and sound effects for things, and learnt from what they'd done. But I hadn't really had much of an opportunity to be sound designing and doing, the whole package, I guess. And obviously, you're not going to do that on a feature film when you're starting out, but you need to do that on, say, short films and, those sorts of projects. And what I wanted to do was have that opportunity by going to somewhere like a film school where there's always people turning out these films. And they're not necessarily films you're going to like. There could be a whole lot of navel-gazing. Anyway, I won't go on about that. But, you go, and that's a challenge in and of itself. That means you've actually got to work with people and you've got to hear them tell you their ideas and actually keep a straight face and try to help to realize what it is they want, whether you agree with it or not, because it's not up to you and it's not your bloody film. It's their film. So that, I think, was a great thing to learn too, that I was looking for. And the other thing was that because I hadn't come from any kind of engineering background, I really wanted to fill in some of the technical aspects of, being at least able to, give a cursory glance to understand a schematic and,
Oh, sure.
solder things together and understand a lot of some of those really basic sound or, some of the engineering, the physical engineering stuff. So I did a course as part of the film school for about 6 months at night, teaching a whole lot or learning a whole lot of that stuff, and it was excellent. So there was kind of those basic things that I wanted to learn, and for better or for worse, I certainly did some things better and some things worse, but that's how you learn, and that was a good environment to do it in. I did a lot of films, and then because I was fortunate enough to already know how to use everything, as I mentioned, the gear-wise and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't such a mystery, so anybody who wanted their film sound cut, I was doing it, and that was great. That taught me a lot.
Sure. As I look at, and I have to admit that in your case, the IMDb database is actually a really good cheat sheet for me. And as I scan this list, I see that you have a couple of assistant listings, but then you pretty much are a sound and dialogue editor. But in 2009, 2010, I see supervising appearing at the front end of a lot of your job descriptions. So what's the difference between a sound editor and a supervising sound editor? What's the differentiation there?
Well, it's basically the supervising sound editor is as it sounds. You're in charge. And when I work as an effects editor, dialogue editor, Foley editor, whatever, I am working. There is a sound supervisor, and the sound supervisor's job is to ostensibly be the main liaison with the client, and which is the director and editor and producers and so forth. And they're the ones that on what is the most crucial part of well, is it the crucial? I don't know, but it's the deciding factor is when you're on the mix stage. So on the mix stage is where the decisions are made, and that's particularly where a sound supervisor is kind of making those choices. But they pick the team of people that will be working on it. they'll, whether it's 2 people or 10, or 30 or whatever,
Sure.
and they're aware of all aspects of the film, and they often have people they trust so that they can concentrate on things particularly, and they'll be talking to people, and they may provide some of the sounds. They may like to, in my case, if there's, because a lot of the time these days I'm cutting more dialogue in ADR, or that's just sort of how things have ended up, and that's totally fine. But when I'm sound supervising, I like to try and cut more of the effects and any of the sound design moments, which is more of the non-literal stuff, just because that's an opportunity for me to do so.
It's an opportunity to be creative, right?
Yeah, it's an opportunity to be creative, and and it's really fun too. So it's like, if I'm going to be the one in charge, I want to have some fun as well.
Of course.
Maybe always the last person to leave, but damn it, I'm going to enjoy it.
Right. So, since sound design is what you view as sort of like the creative thing, what are some examples of sort of extreme but fun sound design tasks that you've taken on?
One aspect is that I guess one of the things I feel about it is I have this sort of love-hate relationship actually with the term sound design, because these days it's kind of bandied around a bit as a kind of cool kid concept.
Right.
And in fact, if truth be known, anybody who works in sound is a sound designer, whether it's the Foley artist who's walking the footsteps, they're designing the sound of that.
Sure.
They may have had information communicated to them by the sound supervisor or somebody else, but it's all designing a sound. It's all designing an aspect of it. So I think of sound design as being, these days it kind of, for want of a better description, is like any of the non-literal elements, or if there's creatures and creature design. Like someone like I had the privilege of working with people like David Farmer and Tim Nielsen, who both hail from Skywalker Sound in San Francisco, and they're both fabulous sound designers, and totally in that way, where they do creatures and kind of really cool stuff. And it is a particular genre, and it is a particular thing where they're concerned. I would absolutely agree with that. But on I guess another film, like on a walk and talk, a picture which is maybe just a drama and people are doing stuff, getting to design the sound. Let's see, this film I did, Won't Back Down, which was, smallish film, and but it's set in a lot of it is set in a sort of working class area of Pittsburgh. So, I went, we wanted to definitely convey that one of the main characters lived in a lower socioeconomic area. So I went down to Skid Row in LA and drove around basically sticking my microphone out the window. And I kindly had a wingman who helped me out, and he was ready to drive quickly if we needed to just kind of get that vibe of people talking stuff in the streets.
Sure.
And, what that sounded like, and the bus station being really nearby. And, you do stuff like you record televisions through thin walls.
Right.
And so that they're incoherent, but everybody knows what that sounds like, and all those sorts of things. So I kind of think of those as being a bit of a sound design moment, and that's actually really fun to do. It's quite exciting to run around doing that. Or a film I was doing earlier this year, which set in a kind of marina. So I spent a whole lot of time recording marina stuff at Marina del Rey here in Los Angeles, and listening to all the different birds and realizing that pelicans actually don't really make much of a noise. And but there's all these other things that do.
Sure.
And, so you do all that kind of stuff, and that's really fun. And then you put that together, and that becomes, you help to create the soundtrack that way and put people in that environment. And it's really fun to do those sorts of things.
Now, when you're particularly doing like background or environmental sound like that, you're still picking up specific instances of sounds. So if you're driving through Skid Row with a microphone hanging out the side of your car, right, and some drunk guy basically gives you the great big hey kind of a thing, right? Do you have to get clearance to use that? Or is it just like, well, you shouted in a microphone, thanks a lot? I mean, what is the protocol for dealing with stuff like that?
Well, in an instance like that, it's a little hairy.
I bet.
Yeah. I mean, if technically what you would have to do is, yes, you would need clearance to use that person's voice. And that's how that works. You know, if you're in a situation where what I was doing was I was stationary when I was recording, if there's just like a clamor of people down the end of a street or something, or somebody coughing, then it's something you're picking up in general. It's not specifically that person. So it means that you're not identifying them. Now, the legalities of this, I could get myself into really hot water if I start getting too specific on this stuff, because I don't really,
Yeah, so I don't want to get you in trouble, so I'm going to avoid that. But I think it's actually a really interesting thing to consider, because I've done some location recording just for my own artwork, and I've always been surprised when I come back to the studio and I wind up the sound and I start listening to it. I'm actually really surprised at how many sort of like site and time specific things that I hear, right? Whether it's a person talking and I'm like, man, I didn't even see them, but now I can remember them walking around behind me, and now I have this whole conversation, right? What are some of the tricks to getting sort of like the right environmental sound without picking up a lot of that stuff? Because I would imagine in a film background, you don't want things that are easily identifiable. You don't want to know that it's Skid Row of LA versus the ghetto of Pittsburgh, right?
That's right. No, you're looking to try to create a somewhat more generic environment, but with that vibe. So I tend to approach it in two ways, and I think it's kind of done. I won't say that everybody does it this way. I'll just say this is the way I do it, but lots of people do. If you've got something that's a little more general and sits into what you would call your background pre-dub, your premix, and in the backgrounds you'd have like your winds, and things would be sort of separated based on the nature of what they are. You know, you might divide them by wind would be one pre-dub, another one would be insects and birds, another one would be, maybe background cars and that sort of thing. And what you would always try to do is if there was something that happened that was quite dynamic, something that would only happen periodically, etc., then you would keep that in a separate pre-dub, or you would use those sounds. Like maybe there was something that I recorded in Skid Row that I really liked but was quite distinct. So you wouldn't want to put that in your background. So you'd put that in your sound effects pre-dub. So you'd actually be able to keep it separate so that you have control over the level of it, so that you can either feature it or not.
Right.
So, because a lot of this is really just about control. So you can still get the vibe of the city, the distant echoes, and the things that sort of make more of a wash, and then any of the specifics. Now that depends on the project as to how dynamic your backgrounds are. But yeah, in terms of tricks of how to record them, it's really trial and error and just listening to what you're recording as you go, if you can, even if it's just earbuds or whatever. You're still going to get at least a bit of an idea about what you're recording. And yeah, I've recorded plenty of like cafes and restaurants and all that sort of stuff, and you've always got that, not always, but often you'll have that one person who's really freaking loud. Who's like yapping away there, and you're like,
yeah, you're screwing up my day, man.
If you listen, just because of the way your microphone's pointed, so you're like, how can I do this? So you just need to position your mic or something.
Sure.
Or you just move to a different part of the room or something. I mean, I find a lot of the time the best, recording technique is just to move.
Right.
You just go to a different part of whatever it is that you're trying to record. Right. And, you can find something that is maybe more appropriate to what you need, or has less of a constant element that you don't want, whether it's a fire alarm or
Well, now I can imagine walking around a marina with a microphone and probably not being bothered too much. I can't imagine sitting in a cafe with a microphone and not having everybody either come up to you and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Or conversely saying, "Can't use my voice." You know, how do you even accomplish some of these things? I can't even imagine.
Well, thank God for technology where stuff's gotten smaller. That makes it awfully easy. That's made it much better. But, you know, you'll be surprised how innocuous you can be. Anybody who's worked in, you know, theatre or any of those sorts of things understands the concept, or even on film sets, of what draws people's eyes. You know, you can actually suddenly become quite, I wouldn't say invisible, but you can move around and you just get yourself into a bit of a position and you just try not to draw attention to yourself.
Sure, and I imagine in LA it's maybe a little bit more common too to see people walking around and doing that stuff.
Which in some ways makes it more difficult, to be honest.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because people are that much more aware of it. And so, as against if you're somewhere where people are not so aware of the process, they think you're doing something, they don't know what it is, but they're too embarrassed to ask you what it is, because then it'll show what they don't know.
Oh, sure.
People are very weird like that. But,
yeah, so in LA, you get a lot of people coming up and giving you their business cards and saying, "Well, if you ever need help on the soundstage, just let me know."
You know, that hasn't happened yet, but that'll be pretty funny when it does. I don't rule it out. But no, it'll be more like people like, "Oh, what are you recording?" You know, because then they've pegged what you're doing,
right,
or whatever. But when I was wandering around the marina and stuff, people would just kind of look at me funny occasionally. But, you know, you can sort of wander around, and if you don't make too much eye contact, you know, it's all just wandering around trying to be as innocuous as possible. You can sort of not do it, and occasionally, you know, you'll realize when you get your recording back, you'll hear somebody going, "I think she's recording something. I don't know what she's doing, but we should be quiet now." And then they whisper incredibly loudly for the next, 15 minutes, and you go, "Shoot."
How much of the recording work, like the location and like sound capture work that you do, is specific to a project, and how much do you do just to build up a library for your own use?
Well, in my case, like I said, over the last few years, I've ended up cutting a bunch more dialogue than sound effects. So, in fact, a lot more of the time when I've been recording sound effects, it's been for my own edification, you know. When I've been traveling somewhere in particular, like a couple of times, you know, a bunch of times being in South America and things like that, and I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going to record something.
Right.
So, you know, for that time when we go back to 80s films about drug lords or something, you know. And so it's just really kind of because it's an interesting environment. I'm being flippant, but it's because it's an interesting environment and somewhere new. It would be for that. But generally when I do a film, and I know a lot of people feel exactly the same, you know, we try to do something special for the film that we're working on, you know, something that makes it specific and something that is special for it, whether it's recording in Skid Row or whatever. Something that or a lot of people like to do as well, you know, it's kind of, it personalizes. I think it helps to personalize the project a bit more. You're a bit more invested in it. Of course, you don't always have the time or anything to be able to do that, or the inclination, etc. So, you know, then you'll be pulling from your library of stuff to achieve the same kinds of ends. And certainly I, you know, rely on the library pretty heavily when I'm doing any of that sort of stuff, and potentially other people's libraries too. You know, every now and again we'll be working on a project or whatever, and somebody will be like, "Hey, have you got any street sounds of da 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 or wherever?" You know, and so there, you know, there is a bit of camaraderie and some exchange that goes on.
So how much of that is faking it? So, for example, if someone says, "Hey, do you have any street sounds from Jakarta?" and all you happen to have is street sounds from Detroit, are you able to pull it off?
No. In that kind of instance, no. I mean, you know, it'd be that's more of a friend thing where somebody says, "Hey, have you got any street sounds of Jakarta?" and so forth. So you wouldn't steer them down the garden path on that one. But I see your point. But no, something as specific as those kinds of things, then, you know, you can't. What are the familiar sounds that everyone thinks of when it comes to, I don't know, you say New York? It's always high-rise honking horns and all that sort of stuff, right?
Right.
With maybe a background of construction and industrial stuff. But basically, it's those honking horns, you know, with the slap that comes off all the tall buildings and all that kind of thing. You know, so you can't turn that into necessarily something else unless that is that environment. And, you know, the sounds of, say, Jakarta are very different because of the type of vehicles that are driving around. You know, it's more diesel, all sorts of stuff. And, you know, the bird and insect life is, you know.
Okay, well, I mean...
But yeah, you can fake some things. One of the best ways to be able to fake it, if you can, is that you have a chance to listen to even a really bad recording of what the place sounds like. So then you can start to piece those elements together from scratch. So then, yeah, you could conceivably go, okay, it's these types of diesel cars. All right, what has those types? Let's find some recordings of those types of cars that have that sort of sound. Okay, what sort of crickets and, you know, insects might we hear from there? Okay, and so yeah, it is conceivable to build it, but you need something to go by to begin with if you're trying to make it believable.
Okay, and now I'll just admit that I pulled, you know, the street sounds of Jakarta like completely out of my ass. And
Sure.
The fact that you're coming at me with, well, there's diesel and you have to think about these kind of insects, just sort of like points to the level of detail and sort of like the vision for a soundscape that you have that I don't have.
Right.
And that's what makes you a pro at it. So my question would be, how can you ever watch a film and not be completely distracted by the sounds? Especially, you know, and I would say not so much a film, but especially like television. Because even I, as sort of like a schmuck, when it comes to some of these things, I will watch some bad cable TV show, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even I can tell, you know, there's that same lightning clap that I've heard 150,000 times, and there's that same scream, or there's that same dog barking rhythm that I've heard a million times. You know, you hear these sort of like ultra stock sounds. That must drive you mad.
Well,
especially if they're misused or misplaced.
oh yes, but I tend to, I don't know, I'll just speak for myself in that I do still really get caught up in stories, even if they're bad ones. So I kind of follow what the characters are doing and what their intention is, and so I don't notice. When, like, if I go to a movie, I will have a cursory understanding of the sound, but I'll generally only focus in on it more if it's either really, really good or really, really bad, you know.
Sure.
It tends to just go with the extremes. If it's not either of those things and somebody says, what does it sound like? I'll be like, fine, I think. Yeah. Because I was caught up in the story enough that it didn't matter. I can suspend my disbelief in that regard. But also that conversely, in fact, if anything, you know, sometimes I think it helps to keep me amused, you know, where it's like if I'm watching something that's truly awful, which, you know, I watch a bunch of stuff also as research, you know, in terms of what people are doing and, you know, or maybe it's stuff that my friends have worked on or people that I know or I'm just curious or something. And sometimes that can be horrible, you know, from a film point of view as a story. But, you know, being able to get caught up in the detail or be caught up in the details and kind of be like, oh, that was an interesting choice. Oh, good. Nice thunder. Yes. You know, so I'm sitting there listening to all the sounds and stuff, and that'll keep me amused if the story isn't.
Sure. Now, man, we're already deep into the amount of time I was going to suck out of your evening, and I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So I'm going to take the long list of things I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to whittle it down to just a few remaining questions. But one of them is really a curiosity for me. When I was doing some background research on you, and surprisingly, I occasionally do that, I ran across something called the Virtual Katy. And it appears to be someone virtualizing a process that you did. Can you explain how you became a software package?
Yeah, well, since you put it like that. Yeah, well, it was actually a friend of mine, John Mackay, lovely man, very talented, very smart. And he and I and a whole bunch of people working on the first Lord of the Rings project, Fellowship of the Ring. And we were getting through enormous amounts of changes. The picture was changing a lot because of, principally because of the visual effects, really. So, you know, things just, they come back they can be moved by a frame or two, you know, and when you're talking a whole film, it's tons and tons of changes. And basically what happens in a nutshell is, okay, if there's picture changes and the sound has already started, the sound post-production, then sound follows picture, right? That's how it works.
Right.
So if they chop 5 feet and 5 frames out of the picture at a certain location, then you have to do so with the sound. So there's a few different ways of doing it, which I won't go into at this stage and everybody be snoring. But the sort of classic way is what's known as a change note is produced. So that says, okay, at 926 feet, and we're using feet and frames here, but you can do it in time code. So 926 feet in one frame, we're going to remove 5 feet and 5 frames. You know, so it's a location point and then a duration of how much needs to be removed, or maybe it's added, or maybe things are moved around. So you have to follow each one of those steps, and they must be done in an order. You know, you have to start at 1 and end at, 300 or however many changes you've got.
Sure.
And because it has a ripple effect, you know, it pulls the picture up. So now that picture is 5 frames and 5 feet, 5 frames shorter, but it means the shot that came after it has to be pulled up as well. So that gap is filled by what was 5 feet and 5 frames later, if you know what I mean.
Got
Sorry,
it. Sure.
am I explaining that in a horribly convoluted manner? But I think you get the idea, where it's like you're making something, you're concertinaing something. So so we would just get these enormous change notes, the size of a bloody phone book, and I would go through them quite swiftly and kind of interpolate the difference, because what happens is sometimes there's a lot of visual effects shots and all that sort of stuff. So in fact, it doesn't make any difference to sound. Let's say, for example, they've done all this stuff, they've changed all these pictures, and that's how it's represented on the page. But in fact, nothing really changed in the sound, or very little. So I would go through and do these calculations. And with film, it's a lot of it's basically, anybody who's done a bit of algebra, it's base 16. And so you do a bunch of algebraic equations, very simple ones, minus and plus, so it's not too complicated. So I was part of that process, and John, being an intelligent guy and so forth, and he's a New Zealand chap, and he just felt that this was extremely inefficient, what we were doing, which it was. So he came up with a couple of other people who work with some different ways of doing things that would make that more efficient. And, you know, it was a series of quick keys and all that sort of stuff. And then he turned it into its own piece of software that would make those changes and initiate them. So you could compare basically an old cut that has tons and tons of chops in it with a new cut, and it would interpolate the difference, and voila, you have the old cut chopped up, but in the places where it needs to be in the new cut. And it did so using what's known as an EDL, an edit decision list, which is ostensibly just saying, okay, it was there, this shot was here, it has this marker number, you know, because there's all these trace backs to the original to what was shot.
The original shot, right?
Yeah, and and it has a unique identifying feature in that sense. And so, okay, it's now been moved to this. It's had its head trimmed off. It's had its butt chopped off, and now it's there. And so basically, the edit decision list tells that information, and that's imported into Virtual Katy, and so forth. And there are other programs that do this process. By the way, that's not the only one. And this was a number of years ago. So my friend John, and unbeknownst to me, because I'd done so much work with all the, doing that job and chopping things up and interpolating the change notes and so forth, he named it after me as also a way to personalize the situation, because it's the sort of job an assistant would do, and it would be their time and everybody's time would be much better spent if a program did it.
Oh, sure. And I imagine that for people that have to run across something like that, it's, probably easier to say, well, I might be able to relate to a Virtual Katy more so than the Wonder Editor 2000 or something, right?
Exactly.
Sure. Well,
so that was the kind of the nutshell story behind that one. But
that's incredible. And again, I don't know the
software. What more could any of us want?
That's right. Well, when all of a sudden you're unemployed and you'll be in the Home Depot parking lot, with "We'll do sound editing for food." We'll all be able to point at this discussion as to why that might have happened.
That's
you got virtualized completely.
I was rendered obsolete.
Now, my one final question then is, to
Sure.
what extent do you see sort of like automated systems replacing jobs in the sound editing world? And to what level will there always be the need for people to be able to make artistic decisions? I think it's one of the things, especially in sort of the more technical aspects of large format art, there's this sense that, well, some of the drone work can be done by automation, but we still really need a person to grace it. Do you think that that's going to always be the case? Do you think that there's going to be ways that things get virtualized, or do you think that it's always going to remain sort of like this human art?
I think it's always going to have an aspect of human art, because it is a personal kind of thing. For a director to impart their vision to somebody else, and they're always going to need to be able to do that, whether it's talking to a composer or whatever. The part of the job that I think is shrinking, apart from the fact that people are just making less movies, is that I think more picture editors are editing the sound as they go and kind of tweaking it, and maybe doing their own kind of aspects of sound design and so forth to render less need for sound editors at the other end. I think that would be more the aspect that where one person is going to wear many more hats, and whether that's the picture editor or even the sound supervisor. I mean, teams of people as sound post-production have definitely shrunk, even in the time that, I've worked in Los Angeles now for 7 years, and I've seen the difference in that time of the size and scale of teams on films and so forth. So I think it's more that, but I think there'll always be a human face to it, and people always need, there is such a creative element to it, whether it's recording the voices or, and then, there's an opinion base to all of it. There's a and that all keeps it quite creative. There's not really any way to automate performance, whether it's a sound design performance, of a non-literal bunch of sounds, or whether it's an actor's performance. You have them coming in again to do it. If you've just got a robot doing that, that's the point where we start going, is there going to be a button on the console that's the performance enhancer, which makes this line now happy and now it's sad, and we all sort of make, rude jokes about that, and maybe that will happen one day, but it will never replace what is in fact a performance. And even if it's putting the appropriate sound effects in the background, sure, a program could work out, you could write an algorithm or something that sort of would go, okay, well, like if a film is something fairly standardized, or maybe it's a TV show or a soap opera or one of those sorts of things that comes back to the same locations, maybe you could automate it so it always comes back to the same sort of backgrounds. Okay, it's this location, so you plug in the continuity notes and you can do all that. But you still need to design that to begin with. You still need to come up with what those things are. So I think we've got a bit of creative job security there.
Sure. Well, I think also too, those kind of automated systems will seldom give you like the leap of creativity that, they might do an adequate job of the most stock version of a thing, but they're never going to give a surprisingly positive result, right?
Yeah, and I think people ultimately like, with notable exceptions, of course, but people like to relate to each other, and they also like to kind of forge out or hammer out ideas or tell people ideas. So a director, an editor, or anybody involved in that, and even if you're doing theatre or you're doing anything, where there is a vision, and talking to a machine is just doesn't have the same ring to it.
Yeah, I hear that.
And I think that people are always going to want to chat to other people, and and it's such a wonderful experience when you get to work with people who are collaborative and sort of like interested in a collaborative kind of thing. But it's also a wonderful experience when you've just got somebody really experienced you're working with. They tell you what they want, and you just make it so number one, and off you go. Right. And it's marvelous. It's great. So I really don't see that disappearing anytime soon.
All right. Well, that is really an awesome way to frame it, and I do think that this sort of like personal interaction thing really is at the heart of what makes great art, no matter what it looks like. Our time is like well up. I really appreciate spending the time with me. This has been the evening with Katy and a glass of wine for me. I had a
glass of wine for me too. Are you kidding?
Well, awesome.
Evening, good Lord.
I appreciate the time and your willingness to discuss all of these things. One final question. There seems to be no end of people who would love to move to LA and get a fabulous job working in the sound part of the movie industry. And I think that, most people in the profession would say, kid, get a barista job back at home. It's probably more available, right? But for those people who really do have the drive and the desire to do it, what are the mechanisms that can help people pursue a career in this area?
I'm trying to think of some sort of clever catchphrases, but I can't think of any. But so I would say, first of all, perseverance in the face of adversity, and I think also having an absolute willingness to start at the bottom and just work your way there and be, I wouldn't say content to do so, but not, how do I put this? It takes time to gather the kind of experience in any kind of profession, These aren't things that intuitively. They're things that you learn on the job, and the way to learn them on the job is actually by listening, which ironically is what we do for a living. So it's important to have the right attitude and just be willing to put in the time and really enjoy it. If you're gonna do something like sound post-production, you really have to love it, because you're going to spend so much time doing it. It's so many hours. It's really late at night. Social life, all those sorts of things. It's really important that. So I think with any job, it's important that you like it enough if you're going to sacrifice so much for it. And, we can make those choices for better or for worse. And sometimes, we sacrifice things incorrectly. But you have to be willing to want to go a certain distance with it. However that comes about. And it requires that level of patience because it really could take a long time. And it is about contacts and so forth and impressing people. But the people that have, quite frankly, impressed me the most have just been more about their attitude, their tenacity, and just being fun people you want to sort of hang out with. Because in post-production, you're stuck with a bunch of people in a room. And that doesn't mean you're supposed to be cool. That just means, that you can have fun. You can enjoy it.
Sure.
And you can get along with other people. So I do think that people's skills are, invaluable in everything, but definitely, when you got to work with a bunch of people. And I think that because you work very closely together, late hours, and sometimes you don't smell so good. So, it's, I think it's, perseverance, a sense of humor, a bit of tenacity, and a whole lot of luck.
Well, and also what you kind of implied there is doing a whole lot of work. I always, I have students that take classes from me, and one of the things I always say is that no matter what it is that you want to do a lot of work, because it's the process of doing a lot of work that actually makes the contacts, helps you learn how to be social in those situations, and kind of gives you a reel to be able to work with as well. So,
yeah, it does, and it really does, and I think that's exactly it. I couldn't say it better.
All right, well, Katy, thank you so much for this time. It was a fantastic and very interesting conversation.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
I've got this long list of more questions, so maybe we're going to have another chat sometime in the future. I would love to dive into the work that you do a lot of, which is dialogue editing, which I probably know almost nothing about. So we will plan on doing this again sometime in the near future. But thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Darwin. I was extremely honored to be in such esteemed company.
All right, thanks a lot, and have a great evening.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
And there you have it, another one on the bucket. Thanks again to everyone who listened. Well, first of all, thanks to Katy for spending the time. What a great and interesting discussion, and really her willingness to share about a lot of details is really cool. I want to thank everyone for listening. I want to thank Cycling74 for giving me the freedom to do this podcast. I want to thank my friends out at Syntopia, Create Digital Music, and all the other online sites that have been helping to spread the word about the podcast. I really appreciate that, folks. And with that, I'm going to sign off for the week. We'll talk to you next time. Looking forward to the next one as well. So have a great one, and do good work this week. Bye.